Hey everyone, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. So it sounds a little silly to say out loud, but I've been thinking about doing this video for weeks now. And the reason why is because I want to spend this video today convincing you that the RG351P is the best retro handheld device you can buy in 2020 for under $100. Now I don't like talking in superlatives, so you know that I mean it when I say something like this. So let's get into it and actually talk about this device and what it is and what it is not. And let's review it. So first of all, what is it? So it is a handheld device that has a 1.5 gigahertz CPU in it. It's an RK3326 CPU. It has its own graphics card and a Mali G31MP2, and it has 1 gig of DDR3 RAM. Now the screen itself is a 3.5 IPS display, which has a 480 by 320 resolution, and we'll get into that later. And then it has a 3500 milliamp hour battery, which is supposed to last up to 8 hours, but the reality is about 6 hours is probably what you should expect. It has stereo speakers on the bottom and they work just fine. It charges via USB-C, but it is not a fast charge. It only does 2 amps or 5 watts at once, so it's not a very fast charging machine. It has dual OTG ports, which allows you to connect things like wireless gamepads or Wi-Fi adapters, and then it has dual analog sticks which have clickable L3 and R3 buttons. So what does this device not have? Well, first of all, it doesn't have an internal Wi-Fi chip, and this is something that was planned initially, and because of issues that the company had with noise created from the chip itself, they ended up taking it out. They ended up scrapping it, and so I got lucky and I actually got a Wi-Fi chip in one of my early copies, but everybody else doesn't have one, and so you're left with using a USB-C port in order to actually access the internet. It also does not have a Bluetooth chip, and the only reason I bring that up is because in the settings it has Bluetooth settings, but you can't actually use them. And finally, it does not have an HDMI out port, and that's not a big deal for everybody, but that was on their previous device, so it's just something I wanted to make note of. Okay, so that's what the device is and what it isn't, but let's talk about what it does. So first and foremost, this is a retro emulation device, right? It allows you to play emulators and play retro games on it. So let's talk about what games you can actually play on it and what systems are compatible with this device. So it plays all of the 8-bit and 16-bit generation games with no problems at all, and it goes all the way up to PS1 with very smooth, very clear, and very great gameplay. There's not a single PS1 game that I've played where I've had any issues, and everything down the line from then on is just perfect. You know, I love the Nintendo games on here. The Super Nintendo games play very nice and crisp. Everything runs perfectly. And along those same lines, handheld games work really, really well. For a handheld device, you know, it really feels good to play a handheld game on it because that's kind of what it was designed for in the first place. A lot of these play much better than they do on the original consoles they were created for. Now, one in particular that I want to highlight and I'll talk about later is Game Boy Advance. Now, the aspect ratio and the screen resolution for this device gives you perfect scaling for the Game Boy Advance. It is like a perfect Game Boy Advance machine. So that's just something to think about. If that's a really important system to you, you're going to love this device. Additionally, arcade games play really, really well on this. Now, I've played arcade games in several different devices before, tried it on my PC and on my Mac and everything else. I love playing arcade games on this more than anything I've ever played on. They play almost every single MAME game you can think of, as well as Final Burn Neo, and then all the Neo Geo games play awesome as well. I'm a child of the 80s, and so for me, being able to play those early 90s classic games is so awesome and so fun on this device. And finally, you also have these 4 systems that you can play: the PlayStation Portable, the DS, the Nintendo 64, and Dreamcast. Now, these do not play at 100%. Depending on the system and depending on the game that you're playing, you're going to have some limitations. For example, some of these play a little bit slower, or they have graphical glitches. They're just not going to play as smoothly and as nicely as the other systems. But if you really have a hankering to try one of these systems out, this is a device that allows you to at least experiment and see if your favorite game works or doesn't. And honestly, even though I've had this device for over a month and a half at this point, I have not been able to untap all of the potential that's in here. So you can see all these other systems are also available for the device, and I've barely scratched the surface in getting these to run. So it leaves me a little bit optimistic because I love tinkering with things. I love kind of playing around and making new things work. And the whole world is wide open for me in this device in figuring out how I can play certain games or certain consoles. And so it's just a really great experience to be able to know that all of the classic games and systems work really, really well, and I still have room to play around with other things and see if I can get them to work as well. Okay, so let's talk about the device itself when it's in the hand, right? It feels really, really nice. Even though it's a plastic device, it feels like they really stepped up their game in terms of the craftsmanship from the previous iterations. So for example, the plastic itself on the device has just a little bit of roughness to it, and it feels really good compared to like the RG350 or even the RG350P. Now it has shoulder buttons on the top as before, it has those two OTG adapters I was talking about, and then it also has a headphone jack, which is on the top. I wish it was on the bottom, but that's one of my minor complaints. So everything runs off of a single SD card. There's also a reset button on the bottom, and a power button on the left, and then this really great volume wheel on the right. I really like this because it can really fine-tune how much volume you want. It's very easy to pull up full volume or all the way down to muted. It's just a really nice experience. Now the buttons themselves feel great. Like they are that perfect mix to me of resistance and mushiness that just feels really good when playing a classic game. The analog sticks also feel good. They remind me of a Nintendo Switch, and they are flush with the device itself, which is also a nice bonus. Now, the RG351P actually comes in 3 different colors. At the time of this filming, I only had the white and the black on me, but you can see here, it's the exact same experience, but a different color, and it's really going to be up to you. So let's bring in some other consoles and compare them just in how they look and how they feel. So here's the RG350M, which is an aluminum version of the RG350, and it works really well. You know, you can see it's a little bit taller. It has a 640 by 480 display, but it also feels very nice and premium. This is the original RG350 here. I've made a couple mods on it, like I've updated the screen and the analog sticks, but in general this feels a lot more like plasticky and just kind of not as good when compared to the 351P. Now, the big daddy of them all is the PS Vita. You know, it has a much bigger screen. You know, it's made by Sony. You know, it's just a much bigger device. And honestly, it feels really good, but in different ways than the 351P. So I don't think it's a fair comparison between the two, but I just wanted to kind of highlight what this size looks like and everything. And then there's the Retroid Pocket 2. Now this is a very popular handheld that also came out this year, and to be honest, this is mostly a paperweight compared to the RG351. Ever since I got the 351, I've had a very hard time keeping up with the Retroid Pocket 2, because even though this is a very nice device, it has a lot of flaws when it comes to the buttons and the controls, and honestly, it just kind of feels like a toy compared to the 351P, which really does feel like an excellent handheld device. So yeah, going back to that 351P, I really prefer the feel of this over any other device so far. And part of that has to do with the really premium build quality, even though it's a plastic device. I don't like that headphone jack being at the top, but honestly, I don't use headphones with this device. But in general, I like how wide it is, and I like how it feels in the hands. It feels very balanced. So let's turn it on and see how long it takes to boot up. And if you remember, it takes about 9 to 10 seconds for the 350 to boot up, and about 40 seconds for the Retroid Pocket 2. Okay, so the 351 splits the difference. It's about 20 seconds to boot. It's not the shortest time in the world, but it's not anything that really bothers me. I think 20 seconds is about right. Now this is the interface here. You can see you can just go between the different systems. This is using a system called EmuElec, and then I'm using a theme that I've tweaked myself called NES Box. And I have guides for this on my website, so I'll leave a link down below that'll kind of redirect you to everything that you can do on this device. But once you click into the system itself, you'll see, you know, it has the individual games and the box art and a video. It's just a very nice and premium and easy to use experience. And to start a game, all you do is just click on it and it'll pop right up. And it's using RetroArch in the background, but in general, that's basically how it runs. Let's talk about comparisons between these three similarly priced devices. So the RG350M and the Retroid Pocket 2 have the same size screen, and it's about, you know, 7 centimeters, so let's say 70 millimeters across wide. Whereas because of the aspect ratio and the small screen size in the 351P, you're only getting about 63 millimeters there. And same thing over here with the height here. It's about 6 centimeters, so let's say 60 millimeters, whereas on this one it's only about a little over 5. And so really you are making compromises in the screen size, unfortunately, and there are some issues with the aspect ratio as well. But in general, you can see that the screen actually looks good. You have to do a lot of configuration to make this work. And I have an actual entire guide and video about how to do this and how to make it work. Because out of the box, I was actually very disappointed with how it looked. Because I was used to this look, which is the 350M, which has this kind of pixel perfect rendering. Because it's 640 by 480, a 4:3 aspect ratio, it just looks really nice on both the Retroid Pocket 2 and the RG350M, using these classic consoles like the NES. Whereas with the 351P, I had to do a lot of tweaking to make it look right. And unfortunately, you lose a little bit of screen size at that point, but it feels really great. It works really well once you do all those tweaks. And that's one of the unfortunate things, is that you have to do a lot of tweaks in order to make it work exactly the way you want it to. But the nice thing is, once you have it down, you don't have to touch it ever again. So let's look, here's the 350M here, and this is just running at a hardware scaling. There's no shaders, there's no kind of alterations to the screen itself, but you can see the pixels just look very nice and crisp and clear and well and balanced. Now if we go into the 351P, you'll see that I'm using a shader in order to make this kind of smooth out, and I'm using this 2x scale HQ shader, which kind of softens the image a little bit. It makes it a little bit rounded around the edges, but in general, if I turn the shaders off, you can see that with full pixelation, it looks janky. Like, you know, some of the pixels are kind of squarish or rectangular-ish, whereas when you look at the RG350M, they look nice and balanced. Mario looks like the perfect pixel that they tried to draw initially. But if you look at that 351, you don't have that same sort of balance. You can see here, Mario just looks weird, like, you know, his eyes look a little bit squared off and weird, and so it's just not, it's not going to work out of the box the way you want. And this is what it actually looks like out of the box, and you can see why I was disappointed. So you have to go in and configure the screen in order to make it work the way you want it to. And that's probably one of my main negatives with this device itself, is that even though the interface and the experience itself is very user-friendly, getting everything set so that it looks nice is not a very easy thing to do. So I'm going to turn the shaders back on, and I'm going to actually start up that shader again, and I'll kind of walk you through this just really quickly. But again, I have a whole screen configuration guide. You just pick that scale HQ shader and then start it up. And you can see we're back to that kind of softened image. And honestly, playing a retro game like this, it actually turns out pretty nice because it has that kind of soft, nostalgic feel to it, which is actually pretty cool. Okay, so let's look at something that has a much larger library. For example, Final Burn Neo. I have the entire ROM set here downloaded, and you can see I have to go through, and I'm using the R2 button to kind of scroll through even more quickly. Unfortunately, there's no quick button to go between letters or anything. You just kind of have to hold it down for a moment. But once you hold it down for a while, it actually goes even faster and faster and faster, so it's not so hard to get from A to Z. So let's start up one of the hardest games to play on any of these MAME systems, which is Street Fighter Alpha 3. And you can see here, up in the top right, I'll show the frames per second for all of these games here. And you'll see it's playing at almost full 60 frames per second the entire time. No matter what I'm throwing at this game, it's working just perfectly. That's a really great sign, and it's hard to explain, but this is something that does not work very well on most of the other systems, but here it runs just about flawlessly. Okay, another game that's difficult to emulate is a game called Red Earth, And these are kind of benchmark games, you know, honestly, they're fun to play. I mean, don't get me wrong, but the most part, people just test these games to see whether or not they're going to run on the system. And it's running at basically 60 frames per second, so that's really awesome. Same thing here with Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3. Now this game actually plays at 54 frames per second, so even though it looks like it's under 60, that's actually what it runs at. And so it runs really well. I actually didn't find any issues with this game, which was very surprising because it's hard to emulate. Now, it's not all perfect. For example, Killer Instinct is a notoriously difficult game to emulate. Even on a high-end PC, it kind of chugs, you know? And so just getting 15 frames per second and getting very clear graphics on this game is kind of an accomplishment, but you're not going to be able to play it and enjoy it. So let's go through and look at other systems now. So let's start with Super Nintendo. Now this is very similar to the NES in the fact that most of these games run really, really well, but you're going to have to configure the screen in order to make it work for you. And again, I'm beating a dead horse here, but I have a guide for all of this, and it does take a little bit of work. Honestly, if you just spend an afternoon kind of learning how to do it, and then setting everything up and saving all your settings, you'll never have to worry about it again. Okay, now some Super Nintendo games don't play as well as others. So for example, here is Super Mario World 2, and you can see that it's not keeping a frame rate of 60 per second, and that's because this game has always been hard to emulate. So what you have to do is actually change the core or the emulator on RetroArch in order to make it work better. So for example, initially we were using the main one, which is SNES 9X, and then I switched to SNES 2010, and then it worked fine. Same thing on the Nintendo 64. So there are two emulators here. This first emulator has very good and crisp accuracy. You can see the lighting's good, the characters are good, but the frames per second are all over the place. And you can see it's just kind of dipping and it's having issues. So this may not be as fun to play because of how slow it is. But here you can see this other emulator has better speed, but the graphics are much worse. You can see Mario is lit really weird, that door is lit really weird. It's just, it's unfortunate, but you have graphical issues, but it plays faster. And so you kind of have to make a decision. Do I want accuracy and low speed, or do I want speed and low accuracy? So here's another Nintendo 64 game, Mario Tennis. Exact same issues here, right? So the accurate emulator plays well, but it just is slow and it's not very fun to play. And again, like I said, you know, Nintendo 64 is not something you should reliably be able to play every single game on. But you see here with even the faster emulator, it works a lot better. You know, it's a lot easier to play, but you can see there's just a lot of graphics issues happening with the characters, and the top left is all weird looking as well. Okay, let's get into handheld systems. So here's the Game Boy, and you can see it's actually running at 2 scale. So it's running at an integer scaling, which means that it's doing perfect rendering of the original scaling, but just at a larger size because this screen can handle more pixels. But you can see obviously when you pull away and you kind of look at it, the screen is actually pretty small here. And unfortunately, that's just kind of how it is, because you want to keep that good aspect ratio, but at the same time you're going to lose a little bit of screen real estate. Now, talking about screen real estate, the one system that works just perfectly is Game Boy Advance. And that's because the aspect ratio is exactly what the original Game Boy Advance was. So that means when you're playing a Game Boy Advance game, it's going to look even better than it did on the original Game Boy Advance because it has double the pixels. So you're having a much nicer, larger screen, much better pixel density, and it just looks great. I can't find any faults in any Game Boy Advance game when I play it on this device. So if you are a Game Boy Advance fan, this is the system for you. I don't think you're going to ever find a system that works better than this device here. Okay, so some other emulators that don't work as well, Nintendo DS. So I've already kind of mentioned before that this is not something you should expect 100% compatibility with, but some games play pretty well. So this is New Super Mario Bros. Here, and it's not playing at a very high resolution. On the Retroid Pocket 2, it actually plays a lot better, but unfortunately, it's just one of those things, but it plays okay. You can actually port over native games. So for example, the Doom games work here. I still need to do some guides on this. I'd like to get other mods of Doom to work, but for now it's really nice. And because it runs in RetroArch, you can use all of those settings that are available there in terms of dual analog stick gameplay and being able to enable different controls and things like that. Quake is another game that works off of RetroArch, and it also works really, really well. These games are really fun to play with dual sticks on this device here. Okay, another thing that I haven't made a guide for yet, but I did figure out how to get working is Pico 8, which is one of my favorite micro consoles. And this actually loads up the actual Pico 8 system itself, which means you need to buy it first for 15 bucks. But once you have it bought, you can load it like you would on a PC. And it works really, really well. The one unfortunate thing about it is it doesn't have internet access, so you can't download games directly onto your device like you could on like your Mac or your PC. But you can just go and grab them and load them onto this device very, very quickly. Let's look at some other classic consoles. So for example, here's Genesis. It runs really well. It looks nice. It has some of those same issues as the Super Nintendo in terms of scaling and just having some pixel issues. But again, my screen configuration guide will walk you through all of that. And then the Sega 32X plays really well as the Sega CD. So all those games are going to work really great on this. Now, Dreamcast is one where it's kind of hit or miss. Some games play really well and others don't. You really just have to experiment and figure out which one works best for you. In general, you know, the games that I really like Soul Calibur, they work just fine. But you can see here's Virtua Tennis 2, and it just doesn't play very well. You know, it's kind of slow. You're getting about 23 frames per second here. You can enable frame skip, but sometimes that looks even worse on certain games. So just play around with it, but don't have too high of expectations when it comes to Dreamcast. Now going over to Neo Geo, everything works perfectly on this. I found zero issues playing any game. Even Metal Slug 5, which is a very intensive game in terms of graphics and everything, it worked just fine. Okay, one star of this show is the PS1. So these games play really, really well. And certain games, which always had issues on the RG350, play perfectly on the RG351. And one of those is Tony Hawk 2, which is one of my favorite games of all time. And it's really, really fun to be able to play this classic game on a device where I don't have to have any compromises. Everything works really well. So the Sony PSP used to be one of my least favorite systems on this device because I couldn't get any of them to work really well. Well, there's been a new update, and I just made a new video about it the other day, and now they play really, really well. It's actually turning out to be one of my favorite devices at this point, one of my favorite systems to play on. You can see here's Virtua Tennis World Tour, and it's playing at almost full speed. Now I'm using frame skip here, and so there is a little bit of compromise, but in general, it's just really fun to be able to play PSP games again on this device. Games like Ridge Racer, which I never was able to get working before, now work really well with this new update. So check out that update, which is in my video stream. Okay, so let's talk about the things I love about this device. Let's wrap it all up. So number one, I love the quality craftsmanship of this device. It just is really well put together. I really enjoy the user interface. I find that just being able to navigate through your games is just a pleasure compared to other devices. The Game Boy Advance experience, like I've mentioned before, is just incredible. I do like some of the network options that they have available, like for example, you can scrape the box art, you can download new themes. Unfortunately, without the Wi-Fi internally, you have to use a dongle, but it's just a small compromise you have to make. Now, emulation on 8-bit systems, 16-bit systems, the PlayStation 1 and arcade are all really through the roof. I was really excited about how well they work. And I love playing games through RetroArch because they all have universal cheat systems, and you can tie it to achievements, which is just really fun. Overall, I really enjoy that part of the experience. Now, what do I not love about this device? So first and foremost, I don't love the aspect ratio. This 3:2 aspect ratio is great for Game Boy Advance, but not for everything else. So either you have to squish your games a little bit, like you can see here with Super Metroid on the Super Nintendo, or you have to get used to having black bars on the sides of your screen. Same thing with this resolution. It causes issues when it comes to scaling, and so you have to do a lot of tweaking in order to make it look right. I don't like that they removed the internal Wi-Fi. I think that they probably should have kept it in, warts and all. The lack of HDMI kind of bothers me, but I don't think it's going to bother everybody. And in general, the firmware setup is kind of difficult to use because there's so many different partitions. And finally, some of those systems that they talk about as being a featured system like PlayStation Portable, Nintendo DS, Nintendo 64, and Dreamcast, those are more like perks because they don't work 100% of the time, and so it's just kind of good to think about it like that. So yeah, in general, this is my favorite device of 2020. I've played a few of them here throughout the year, and I've done a lot of testing, and I'm not somebody who sits there and gives glowing reviews to everything, but I will say that I really love this device. I've had it for 6 weeks now, and I play it every day. And I think that that is a really good testament to just how nice it can be once you put everything together, and you put a little time into it to make sure it works. And hopefully my guides will get you through all that. So if you're as excited about this system as I am, let's actually talk about it, right? So long story short, I ordered an RG350P in order to test with, and Amazon accidentally sent me an RG351P, the very system that we're talking about today. And it has a little smudge and stuff on the box itself, but I opened it up and it works just fine. So I decided instead of returning it to Amazon, I'm just going to give it away to one of my subscribers. So go ahead and follow the link below. I have a contest there. You just put in your name and email, and if you win, I will send this out to you. No questions asked or anything else like that. One thing I am going to do, though, is I'm going to limit it to the United States just because I can't pay an arm and a leg for shipping. But anyway, if you're interested in getting your own RG351P, please follow the link below and maybe you'll win this one. So that's it for this video. I really hope you enjoyed it. I know this was a little bit longer than maybe my typical video, but I really wanted to get into the details and talk about why it is I love this device so much. So let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. And if you found this video helpful, I would really appreciate it if you liked and subscribed. I'm going to be doing a ton of videos here in the future, so I'd really love it if you join me for this ride. So that's about it. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. Happy gaming.